Okay, I'd like to thank all of you for coming to our debate tonight on the proposition resolved, the internet is essential for democracy. My name is Jim Reed. I'm the interim director of the Eugene J. McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement, of which tonight's debate is closely connected. The mission of the McCarthy Center, which is named after one of St. John's most eminent alums, Eugene McCarthy, the mission of the McCarthy Center is to cultivate the habit of promoting the common good through an integrative environment for learning, to promote the value of politics, our shared identity as citizens, our engagement in public work. I'm very honored to have Kathleen Jamieson as the McCarthy Center Spring resident. Kathleen will be here for 3 days. This is the first major public event of her residency. She's been going to classes and meeting with students outside of classes. And I wanted to especially mention tomorrow night she will be giving the keynote address of her residency at Goreski, at St. Ben's at Goreski 204A. And the title of her keynote address is, quote, "How the New Media Are Affecting Us and Our Politics." All of the theme of this residency altogether is different new forms of media, things like internet, and how they affect our politics. So what we're going to do, I'm now going to turn this over. The debaters here have been working on this for now since the beginning of the spring semester. I'm very glad you come here, and now I'm going to turn this over to Terry Check, who has been one of the communication department. Terry Check of the communication department and Christy Siver of the political science department have been the two faculty members working with the debaters, and Terry is going to talk about the debate and introduce the debaters.
Thank you for coming. Tonight we're going to be debating the topic resolved that the internet is essential to democracy, and of course this topic is extremely timely. In June 2009, young Iranians poured into the streets of Tehran to contest what they viewed was a fraudulent election. Within hours after news of their protests broke, Western media had packaged the events as proof of the liberating power of technology. In a series of posts, The Atlantic magazine, for example, indicated that the revolution will be Twittered. Even National Public Radio's Daniel Shore announced that, quote, "In Iran, tyranny has run afoul of technology in the form of the internet, turning a protest into a movement." And the New York Times jumped on the bandwagon as well when they stated in an article by Nicholas Kristof that the quintessential 21st century conflict is on one side government thugs firing bullets, and on the other side young protesters firing tweets. Well, if the results in Iran weren't quite the way we had desired them to be, online enthusiasts felt vindicated earlier this year when recent events in Tunisia and Egypt seemed to indicate the power of the internet was here to stay. So the new technology of the 21st century has now been credited with toppling regimes of the last century. This is the kind of narrative that's been repeated frequently in news reports. For example, a CBS Evening News report last month stated that one of the biggest players throughout this crisis has been social technology. It's phenomenal how social media is affecting how Egyptians are behaving with each other and how the world is processing this entire event. That's the narrative that's out there. Yet as tonight's debate will demonstrate, there are competing arguments on this very question. There are some who believe that mainstream media has constructed a myth about the liberating power of the internet. And in tonight's debate, we'll hear competing points as to the role of Silicon Valley and whether or not it has, in fact, helped democratic movements change authoritarian regimes, or whether or not its power has been vastly exaggerated. Tonight's debate will be between three debaters on each side, and I'll talk just briefly about the format and then turn it over to the debaters. We'll have three speakers on each side. Each speech will be about 4 to 5 minutes long. We'll do all 6 debaters, and then at that moment we'll have a short period where there'll be about 10 minutes of questions and comments that we'll take from the audience to the debaters or to Kathleen Hall Jamieson, who joins us here tonight as the moderator and respondent to the debate. After that, we'll have a short rebuttal from each of the sides of the debate. It's only a few minutes long, at which point then we'll hear from Dr. Jamieson and her comments about the debate. And then we'll move into, I guess, kind of a discussion period after that, where you'll have the opportunity to ask direct questions of Dr. Jamieson about this important topic. So without any further delay, I'd like to introduce the debaters. On the pro side, we have Stephen Pesavento, Michelle Wild, and Susuma Maeda. And on the con side, we'll have Lauren Curry, Caitlin Coleman, and Kunihiro Shimoji. And so we'll start with the pro side, that the internet is essential to democracy, and Stephen.
Thank you, Terry. First, I want to start out with some thank yous. I want to thank the audience. I want to thank everyone for coming out here to listen to this debate today. I want to thank the opposition team for agreeing to be part of this debate, and I want to thank my partners as well for being part of this debate. I also want to give a special thanks to the McCarthy Center, Jim Reed, Stacy Penk, Christy Siver, and Terry Check for helping to put this together for us tonight. But I also want to especially thank Dr. Kathleen Hall Jamieson for being with us tonight to join us for this debate. So, we are in a new era where the internet and social media can empower global democratic movements. In the past, authoritarian regimes have been able to censor old media and have control over it to mislead the public. The new development of the internet has made it possible to connect billions of people worldwide and has been essential in promoting effective participation in democracy in today's time. In utilizing the internet, the people of Egypt were able to revolt against an oppressive authoritarian government, and through its use have been able to organize democracy within their country. In today's debate, our sides will prove the internet is essential to democracy, and we will advance this in 3 main arguments. The first argument: the internet creates transparency in government, which promotes productivity within government. The second is that internet gives citizens the ability to communicate quickly so they can organize and promote democratic movements around the world. And finally, the internet leads to further citizens and journalist engagement in democratic activism. So first, government transparency is important to the operation of a successful government in this day and age. The Obama administration has pledged for transparency within its executive system. The Obama states, transparency promotes accountability and provides information for citizens about what their government is doing. Through this, he has established the Open Government Directive, which its goal is to build trust and avoid corruption within government. We can see that through the internet, it allows transparency within governments. The internet has allowed for the release of thousands of government documents by organizations like WikiLeaks. These organizations receive classified documents and then release them to the public online. On October 22, 2010, over 400,000 Army filed reports were released to describe the death tolls of citizens that were killed at the hands of the U.S. military. One set of data shows that nearly 15,000 civilian deaths had occurred, but the U.S. military had previously claimed that they were not counting these civilian deaths. So while this was going on behind the citizens' back, people were dying around the world, and the U.S. has been keeping track of civilians killed in Iraq and Afghanistan and lying about it, which basically turns into distrust within our government. The link here is that WikiLeaks, through the use of the internet, has informed citizens of these injustices and has brought citizens forward to force the government to be held accountable. We can see the impact of this is that the support for the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have gone down dramatically, and many people are pushing for complete pullout because of these war crimes that have been going on by killing civilians. Similarly, in early January, the Middle East equivalent of WikiLeaks was released, which is known as the Palestine Papers. The Palestine Papers are the largest leak in the history of the Israeli-Palestine conflict. Nearly 17,000 files were released and published by Al Jazeera on their website online. These documents contained information about government meetings that were previously public, that were not previously public, that contained information about the negotiations that they were doing regarding where they were going to draw the borders and what these compromises had detailed. But the problem was that none of the people had known about what their governments were compromising on. And the fact is that the civilians themselves are the ones who have to live with these compromises that their governments are making decisions over. And because of this release of information, it has led to further engagement in the process, which will lead to increase in democracy by including the public's opinion. So this access to information about people's governments from internal or external sources begins to force officials to be upfront from the beginning. And it forces those governments to take responsibility for their actions. The behavior of withholding information from the public leads to degradation of democracy simply because it misinforms its citizens. If it weren't for the internet and its ability to transmit mass amounts of data, the public could never find out these facts. Transparency is linked to uprooting oppressive regimes because with this access to information, citizens can force their government to be accountable. Therefore, internet is essential to democracy in today's day and age. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Lauren Curry, and first I just want to start off with some thank yous. First, thank you to Dr. Kathleen Jamieson for being here and moderating our debate, and also thank you to Dr. Christy Siver and Dr. Terry Check for helping us with this debate, and thank you to the McCarthy Center for hosting. I also like to thank my teammates in the opposition. I think we're going to have a great debate here tonight. So first, tonight, my teammates and I, Kuni Shimoji and Caitlin Coleman, and I stand in negation of the resolution that resolved the internet is essential to democracy. While in current events, we have seen how the internet has completely transformed the government in Egypt. However, activists in Iran attempted to use social networking to overthrow their government. This was ultimately unsuccessful, and it proved that the government was stronger. And this proves that not only was the government not essential, but it was also not efficient. During our three speeches tonight, we will argue that the internet is absolutely not essential to democracy. First, I will discuss the internet and its chilling effect on the diplomatic relations between democracies. And secondly, we will discuss the history of the internet and how totalitarian governments use the internet to track down and censor citizens. Lastly, we will discuss how the governments use internet to create and distribute propaganda in order to distract their citizens with non-political information. Throughout this debate, my teammates and I will provide you with both historical and current examples to show the internet is not crucial to democracy. To frame this debate and to make sure the concepts are clear, the negative would like to clarify definitions. The negative would like to reiterate the definition of essential. We are defining essential as absolutely necessary or indispensable. We do this because it holds the affirmative team to a higher threshold and forces them to show exactly how internet is crucial to democracy. Now that we've discussed how to frame the round, we can now discuss the point of the internet and why it is not essential to democracy. Tonight, I will be discussing the internet and its role on diplomatic relations. Through recent events, which I will discuss later on in this speech, it has become increasingly evident that the internet has had a chilling effect on diplomatic relations between and within democracies. This is first seen through the internet age has made a collection and distribution of data and information much easier, and this has led to many disastrous consequences. We can see this first in the example of WikiLeaks. Many of you probably know that WikiLeaks was a website that allowed for the posting and distribution of classified documents from the United States, as well as multiple other countries such as China. This has allowed the entire world to view these governments' most classified documents. For example, the United States has documents labeled NOFORN, and these specific documents are not supposed to be viewed by even the United States' closest allies. These documents were subsequently posted on WikiLeaks. Secondly, we will discuss the spread of information and how that has ultimately led to a chilling effect on diplomatic relations. First, WikiLeaks has hindered the United States' democratic influence within other countries. Other countries now have access to the United States information on foreign policy, giving the perception that the United States has a weak informational infrastructure, which we all know is clearly not true. For example, in Egypt, WikiLeaks exposed covert U.S. funding opposition to groups in Egypt for pro-democracy movements. And this ultimately led to the decreased credibility of these pro-democracy movements. So we can see that this transparency in these WikiLeaks have ultimately led to the undermining of democracy. Secondly, the access to the internet has also led to haphazard political decisions. People are now able to make diplomatic decisions with the click of a mouse, rather than actual thought-out rational decisions. The internet has become a tool to make foreign policy, which is not real policy. Stephen came up here and discussed the issue of the Palestine Papers. And the release of these papers are especially detrimental because it allows extremists to destroy all hope for moderated debate. Now everybody knows what is contained within these documents, and it makes it so the extremist sides can take charge of this debate rather than have moderated conclusions of debate. This has proved that we need more moderated discussions behind closed doors for the safety and well-being of other citizens. Lastly, while the affirmative team debates why we need more transparency in the system, it is crucial to recall that the United States is a representative democracy, and this means that America elects officials who they can trust to make decisions. And not everything needs to be transparent, because ultimately, if we keep things a little bit less transparent, it's going to be best for safety and best for moderated, politicized discourse. Finally, through these specific examples, it is clear to see the use of the internet is not essential to democracy. The internet has actually disrupted United States foreign policy through releasing classified documents, hindering the United States' democratic influence in other countries, as well as created foreign policy by the click of the mouse rather than real policy. And we'll see that transparency has ultimately led to undermining democratic movements and democracy in and of itself. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Michelle Wild, and I would also like to thank you all for coming today. And today I'm going to argue that the internet is essential for democracy because old forms of media are simply no longer sufficient to wage a successful large-scale uprising against a government that does not support democracy. And the internet is able to do this because it is fast, it is especially well formatted for these opposition groups, and it allows for community building in a way in which old forms of media were not able to do. So first, everybody knows the internet can spread information incredibly quickly. For example, in 2009, 20,000 Moldovians were able to organize themselves and turn out to protest just 36 hours after the plan was initially conceived. And this example is particularly important because there had been no recent history of mass protest in the area before. So even the organizers thought that only a few hundred people would turn out. Nevertheless, the group was able to successfully storm Parliament and force a recount of the recent election because the government was surprised that that many people were sufficiently upset about the situation to actually go out and protest. Furthermore, once these demonstrations are occurring, the internet allows the organizers to adapt their plans in the middle to adapt to changing conditions on the ground, especially because a lot of these people now have access to internet on their phones. For example, in 2006, Filipinos were able to use their phones to coordinate so that they all showed up at the protest location at the exact same moment, thereby making their impact much greater than if they had trickled in gradually. Furthermore, after the demonstration was over, they were again able to use their phones to contact everybody involved to make sure they were all safe. And in this way, they were able to save lives and preserve their manpower for future demonstrations, thereby making their long-term success more likely. Secondly, the format of the internet is especially well suited for these opposition groups, particularly because anyone can publish online. This not only saves time because you don't have to convince an editor to print or air your story, but it also allows for more specified knowledge to be distributed. For example, recently Tunisians were able to tell Egyptians through Facebook how to prepare themselves against tear gas and rubber bullets that their government might use against them. This is the type of knowledge that is not general enough to appeal to a large audience, so the mainstream media probably wouldn't cover it. But for those Egyptians, it was crucial in making them much more prepared and much more resilient against their government attacks, in which they were eventually successful. Now lastly, the internet allows for community building in a way that old forms of media cannot do, especially through social networking sites such as Facebook and even Twitter. A good example of this was the recent Facebook page, We Are Khaled Said, in which Egyptians were able to rally around this one figurehead and really come together to form a community. This Facebook page is a good example because it shows that it wasn't just about the speed of the internet, as that page encouraged older forms of communication as well, and even provided downloadable flyers for people to use. So it really was more about the community building in that instance. And lastly, I think the internet just makes these demonstrations a lot more personal. I know if I went on Facebook and saw that all my friends, or even people I hadn't heard from in a few years, were joining the demonstrations, I would have a much higher incentive to do something than if I just saw hundreds of faceless demonstrators on TV. So in this way, I think the internet can cause greater participation even if you don't sign up for one of those particular pages for the movement. So in this way, I think these three advantages of the internet, its speed, its unique format, and its ability to build communities are essential if you want to be successful in an uprising against a repressive government. If you can't communicate quickly and convince people that they aren't alone, you're simply not going to have the manpower or the willpower necessary to be successful.
Thank you guys again for coming here, and especially students. It's Monday, instead of doing homework in the library, being here, amazing. Okay. My name is Kunihiro Shimoji, and I'm going against the internet is not essential for the democracy. Looking at the current historical democratic movement, the people, those who are in charge of the democratic movement, have not relied on the social media. I don't remember George Washington was tweeted. I don't recall Gandhi had Facebook. It is faulty reasoning to say that the social media caused a revolution in Egypt. There is actually a dark side of the technology, and it can be used by a dictator to keep his power and the ideology in the nation. There's two examples that we can see the problem that internet has: surveillance and then censorship. Surveillance. By using the surveillance system, which is monitoring of behavior, activities, or changing of information, the government can observe the individuals and groups' action to keep the social order, which is ideal to the government. Currently, nations like Iran, China, and then Venezuela embrace the internet as a tool to public surveillance. According to Morozov, in 2009, Iranian government formed the cyber crime team and then tasked it in the finding of false information on the internet and then Iranian website. Those spreading false information in the internet were to be identified and arrested. Also, the Iranian media, also the Iranian police began hunting the internet photos and the videos, which has the face of the protesters, and then identified and arrested those protesters. Also, the same thing happened in China. After the Jasmine movement outbreak in February 2011, the Chinese government used a public surveillance system to find all the protesters and arrested them all. As we can see that the totalitarian government can use the internet as a tool to keep the track and then punish protesters to keep the power and the ideology in the nation. Censorship. I would like to remind the audience that the internet will help anti-democratic movement as well as it does to pro-democratic movements. Social networking is good because that the people can get together and work closer to do something such as the cases that we saw in Egypt and in Tunisia. However, we have to remember that the social networking is an open field to any single aspect of the social movement, which includes the anti-democratic movements. The social network is a double-edged sword. The government can also control the public access to the internet itself. In addition to the surveillance system, the government uses censorship, putting a limit to the access to a certain website or the internet itself, in order to keep its power in the nation by hiding the negative information for the government. For the censorship issue that we can look at the example in China. According to Morozov, as the Chinese authorities began warning about the growing unrest in the Muslim Western city in Shenzhen in 2009, the authorities simply turned off all the internet communication for 10 months. As we can see that a totalitarian government who is not happy with the democratic movement in her nation can simply shut down the system and then restrict the information on the internet. Moreover, they can search the person through the internet and the police forces can easily find and then arrest those protesters. With all the examples and argument that I mentioned in my speech, the opponent team strongly believes that the internet is not essential for the democracy. Yes, internet is useful and then faster. However, the internet is just one of those tools. It is not essential. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Susun Maeda. I'm a proud side of today's debate. So we say the internet is really essential to the democracy. The revolution in Egypt happened and is heating up is all by the Facebook right now. The internet encourages engagement in three ways. First, it creates an informed citizenry that presses for democratic reform. Second, information spreads to other countries. And third, it encourages the journalistic reform. First, the internet spreads the political information which creates an informed citizenry. The more people participate in the politics through the internet, the more they are informed, and an informed population will apply their political knowledge for democratic reform. For example, revolution in Egypt. Informed people in Egypt make Protestant group, and they are trying to change their own country. Of course, there is a risk. Sometimes it's really bloody. But what is happening in Egypt is a positive nation change, I think, caused by the internet. What people, especially the young, are doing is to seek freedom. Second, the internet encourages the spread of information to other countries as well. As the internet releases information on the global level, the citizens in neighboring countries are encouraged to form democratic movements on their own. For example, Facebook and Twitter in Arab. The Libyan revolution is also heating up by the Facebook fan page. The communication releases the current revolution history in the Arab and network broadcast ideas and unlimited publication of the stories of protests. According to a newspaper in India and a US radio network, Google executive was one of the organizers leading the protest. He manages a Facebook fan page about Mohammed El-Barazai, who was one of the members of intergovernmental organizing under the auspices of the UN, and used social media to mobilize demonstrators with his Facebook. And the CBS News radio network appearing Harry Smith said, "Our revolution now is just like Wikipedia." Third, internet and social media have changed journalistic practice. Accountability of the media has problems. For example, according to a journalist in an independent internet publishing company. Presently, Pakistanis are demanding that star anchors of various current affairs programs and other journalists be held accountable for their actions, because the most people distrust the media and those who practice journalism nowadays. Multinational corporations and NGOs appear inviting them to various events, especially for the journalists, senior journalists. In order to get attention on press clippings, NGOs and multinationals are using even bribes for journalists. By doing that, the tabloidization of the journalism can be changed positively. I mean, the monopolizing manipulation in the media will be eliminated eventually, so that by doing this action in these three ways, highly information aware people become essential function for a democracy. People do not become the object of the democracy, but the subject of the democracy by the internet. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. My name is Caitlin Coleman, and I'll be explaining why internet is not essential for democracy. Mass media has led us to believe that there will be utopia and democracy with the increased use and access to the internet, when in fact, behind the scenes, there are governments who are using the internet to promote non-democratic ideas. In my speech, I will focus on two ways in which governments are able to use the internet to their advantage. First, authoritarian governments use the internet to promote and spread their propaganda. Second, non-democratic governments use the internet to distract their citizens from political activities. One of the main critics of the internet is Yevgeny Morozov, who wrote the book Net Delusion and the Dark Side to the Internet. In this book, he explains how authoritarian governments are able to use censorship and new social media to promote and spread their propaganda. An example of this can be found in China. A group called the 50-Cent Party is a group where they are supposedly paid 50 cents for every pro-government comment they leave on the internet. Now, the goal of this group is to safeguard the Chinese Communist Party by leaving comments that will direct the Chinese citizens to support them. Now, the Chinese officials have said that they do not mind the public reaching their own individual and independent conclusions, but they will do their best to manipulate the evidence. Now, this is how a government is able to take the internet and turn it into a spinternet. And what I mean by this is that they are able to spin the internet to promote their own ideas. Many similar examples of this pro-government internet commentators can be found in Nigeria, Cuba, and Iran. To elaborate more, an article written by PBS in 2009 called Just Like Facebook, Iran has a Facebook-like website called Valayet Madaran. This website is a friendly environment, they say, where they will promote and talk about methods on how to defeat the enemies of the sacred Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, this is an example of how governments are using the internet to talk about non-democratic ways and to stop democracy from spreading. Moving on, my second point is cluttering, which is a tool used by authoritarian governments to distract their citizens from political activity. Now, the internet is decentralized in nature. What I mean by this is that there's just not one site that you can go to get all your information. There's an abundant amount of sources on the internet. Now, the authoritarian governments use this to their advantage. They allow many Western pop culture to be available while censoring out political information. A New York Times article wrote about Burma in 2010. Here it was noted by a Burman businessman that the government is trying to distract their people from politics. There's not enough bread, but there's a lot of circus. To elaborate more on this idea, I'll explain that Burma's government was using the tool of cluttering to distract their citizens. Moreover, a 2009 article written by The Telegraph called Social Media and the Internet Does Not Spread Democracy explains how authoritarian regimes have successfully appropriated the tools of social media for their own anti-democratic ends. There is nothing intrinsically liberalizing of the Internet. This quote means that any kind of media technology can be easily subverted by political dictatorship. Lastly, the decentralizing nature of the Internet, explained by Morozov, is that the clutter of the Internet also satisfied and distracts dissidents to their governments. This is also another harmful outcome of cluttering. I believe Morozov best summarizes my argument. He says, what about instances where the Internet actually prevents democracy from coming about? When dictators use social media to track the populace, plant pro-government bloggers and online activists, and in short, increase their own power? The two examples I have provided show how anti-democratic governments are able to use the Internet to promote their propaganda, distract their citizens from political activity, and confirm that the Internet is not essential for democracy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to the student speakers for such engaging arguments. Before we hear the final rebuttals from each side, as well as the response by Dr. Jamieson, I'd like to open it up to the audience for questions and comments. We have a microphone in the center, and we could also certainly raise hands and shout out questions if you'd like, but we'll have 10 minutes for this so that we can get to Dr. Jamieson's comments, and then we'll have some time after her comments for questions that we might want to direct to her. Questions or comments? Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for coming. It's a great audience out here. The question I guess I would ask all of our great student debaters here today, a large part of your debate centered on the word essential, and I understand that. My question would be, do you think any of you, throughout your research and when you were organizing the debate, would bring up the idea that the Internet is a great tool for democracy, or would any of you argue on the side that the Internet overall is harmful towards democracy? And if you could go in more into the pros and cons of that, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, for the question. As I said in my speech, Internet is really helpful for the democracy because it's fast and helpful. However, as I said, did Gandhi have a Facebook? Did George Washington use Facebook or tweeted to talk about the meeting next week? No. The Internet was useful, and it is just a tool. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so obviously the internet is a really great tool, but I would say that it's also becoming more and more essential, and I would say that it is now essential because the government forces and everybody else has been increasing their technology since the beginning of time. So I think if you want to rise up against a repressive government, you have to use all of the tools available, and I think today that includes the internet, and if you don't have that, you're going to be easily squashed by the government that does use it, just as Caitlin was saying, to suppress their citizens.
Interesting. Go ahead.
All right. I'm wondering, I have actually been doing some research for a research paper in one of my classes about loneliness, and I've come across some stuff that says that online social networks and internet has led to sort of an increased emotional disconnect between people and events and other people. And I'm wondering how that affects democracy, positive or negatively. I guess especially because I thought the question, especially with the way that Facebook was used to organize events and things like that. So, thank you.
Okay. I did also find an article about that in researching for this, and I found it convincing until I realized that in a lot of these countries, organizing face-to-face is very dangerous, if not illegal. For example, in Egypt, gatherings of 5 or more people were completely outlawed unless you had permission from the government under their state of emergency laws, which were enacted for several years. So I think in a situation such as that, sometimes the internet can be the only way in which you can connect with and communicate with people that are like-minded. And if you don't have any type of communication with people that agree with you, then it's very easy to feel like you're the only one, and then you would lose hope and just feel like everybody else is right.
Con side, have anything to say about that?
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Okay. When I was researching also, and I came upon some interesting facts. And if you want to talk to me later, I have some great sources for you. But what I found when I was researching is that they said that internet has found to erode the community hearth, and it talks about how people aren't like the debate last year was about civic engagement. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to go, but it'd be interesting if you could also maybe talk to the debaters from last year. But yes, I found that it is interesting to see how the media is affecting our social engagement and civic engagement. But from what I found, in my brief research is that they did say community hearth, so it was interesting. But I don't really have anything else, so sorry.
I hope you didn't find those sources on the internet. So anyway, so other questions from the audience? Okay, back there.
So my question is directed more towards the negative side of the debate. Kuni referenced a city in western China, an Islamic city that had a democratic movement that was, well, my first question is, was it able to be successful regardless of the government intervention? Because I'm not sure if you mentioned that. But you mentioned that the Chinese government shut down the internet for 10 months. And throughout history, it seems to me that when a government bans literature or behavior or some other social function is because they recognize the importance or they recognize the challenge to their authority that could be posed by such literature or behavior. And so my question is that through their action of disabling the internet for 10 months, could this indicate the importance or the essentiality of the internet to the democratic movement?
Good question. I think that, yes, your point is great, and then I think it's really important. But even though the government set the limit and restrict the access to the internet, there's actually so many democratic movement out there in China that proves our point that internet is useful. However, there's actually the way that people come up with the democratic movement, and then people can organize some other way, and people can find other way around to organize democracy. Yes, people in China find some other way, and then that means the government saw a fear that this democratic movement is trying to shape they try to shape the democracy through the internet. So that does show that internet is useful. However, as we can see on the other side, that there's always other way around.
And I think my point kind of relates here when we talk about the internet leads to haphazard politics more so. We discussed how it comes down to a click of a mouse nowadays, more so than rational policy thought. People nowadays, politicians are making more and more decisions based off of the click of the mouse or the convenience of the internet.
Maybe we have time for one more question.
Hi. On the pro side, it seemed like you focused a lot on revolutions, or at least protests and uprisings, and on the con side, it seemed you focused a lot on non-democratic governments. I was wondering if both sides could elaborate on how the internet impacts standing democracies like the U.S., UK, and kind of places that aren't the extremes on either side, because it seemed like both of you gravitated towards those viewpoints.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I definitely think we can see how it is affecting us within the United States directly by the example of WikiLeaks. There's a lot more examples than the one that was brought up about the civilian deaths. But when we find out that our government is actively engaging in basically war crimes against people, civilians of the United States are not happy to find that out. And through having transparent governments, we can try to prevent all this corruption that goes on within the government systems to help promote democracy within our own country. And by having more information out, like both my partners brought up, having more information available on the internet, it propagates engagement, because if people know more about what's going on in the United States and around the world, they're more likely to get engaged and vote or get engaged in protest. So we can definitely see that even within active democracies, it can promote the act of engaging within that democracy.
And also in my speech, I kind of covered, I covered how it's affecting the United States standing right now. The United States, it's affecting the diplomatic relations within the United States, such as with WikiLeaks. It affected our relations with Egypt, because we were funding the pro-democratic movement there, and that actually decreased the credibility of these pro-democratic movements. So it not only affected the United States' credibility, but also those movements in Egypt. And we also discussed also the Palestine Papers and how that's undermining democracy there as well.
Okay, thank you. We'll have an opportunity for additional questions and comments after the full discussion. I'd like to proceed now to the last two student speeches. In the tradition of academic debate, the side that has the burden of proof speaks first and last. So we'll hear first from the negative, delivering their rebuttal, and then we'll get a final speech from the pro side.
Okay, so I just want to start with some thank yous again. So thank you everybody again for coming out here tonight. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate your support. And thank you again, Dr. Kathleen Hall Jamieson, for moderating, and to Dr. Terry Check, as well as Dr. Christy Siver. Thank you for helping us form our discussions here. And thank you to all the debaters. Great debate, everyone. I really think we had some really good clash. So first, now on to closing arguments. While we have seen in the Middle East, we are now embarking on a new era of internet through social media that has made mobilization almost instant. And the internet, but we have also found that the internet is truly not essential to democracy. However, there is this unchallenged position that technology and the spread of information is always good. Unfortunately, this is not always the case, as my teammates and I have proved during this discussion. And so just to go into our arguments that we debated here, through the argumentation of both my teammates and myself, it is evident that the internet can be used against the governments and therefore is not essential to democracy. First, we have shown this evening in 3 speeches that first I discussed how websites like WikiLeaks have made it so classified documents are free for the entire world to see. And we're going to see that ultimately leads to the impact of the democratic movements such as in Egypt. We're actually undermining democracy with this spread of unlimited information. And this has also chilled diplomatic relations within and between democracies, such as with the example in Egypt, where the internet actually undermined a democratic movement as well as made the United States, a standing democracy, less credible. It also has led to haphazard politics through making decisions through a click of a mouse rather than actual policy. And also, my partners have proved that Cooney discussed how democratic governments have existed without the internet. Therefore, it is clearly not essential to democracy. We've seen democratic movements, we've seen standing democracies without internet. Cooney also discusses that the internet is not essential, it is simply a tool. Totalitarian regimes can also watch and censor their people through the internet, and that's undermining democracy as well. These regimes can also simply shut down the internet, making it null and void. Lastly, Caitlin talks about how the idea of spinternet, where governments can simply spin the information to promote anti-democratic ideals and other propaganda. We have seen through empirical examples in places such as Nigeria, Cuba, and Iran, these governments can utilize the internet to censor and propagate their ideas. And the internet cluttering can also distract citizens from political activity, which is ultimately going to be detrimental to democratic societies. So we've proven throughout all of our speeches that we have a democratic society right now in the United States, but it's being constantly undermined by the release of more and more information, because we elect representatives to make decisions for us in democracy and protect us, and that's being undermined by the transparency of information. So overall, we have proven how there have been democratic movements, and it's ultimately not essential. The internet is not essential to democracy. So I thank you for your time tonight.
Once again, I want to thank everyone for coming here today. We did have some great clash. It was a pretty enjoyable debate. But right now, I'm going to sum up the reasons on why internet is essential to democracy. First and foremost, we brought up three main points on the affirmative that why it is essential to democracy in today's day and age, because we're not debating what's been going on 200 years ago, we're debating what's going on now, because internet was not around back then to help be an essential tool in democracy. So first, we can see that it's essential in providing transparency within governments. It was brought up that WikiLeaks was a negative thing towards promoting democracy, but actually it's exactly the opposite. It's given the American citizens and people around the world the power to know what is actually going on, and the American citizens should know whether their government is committing war crimes around the world under their name. We think this is essential to promoting democracy in a fair way, because if they continue to have war crimes happening under the label of democracy, it would go completely against what the whole point of democracy is. And so moving on to the second point that was brought up about the Palestine Papers, and that it lets extremists take over debate, we can actually see that this allows the citizens to actually have control in their government, because they are the ones who have to deal with the decisions that are going to be made in the end. And so it's not about the extremists, because there's always going to be extremists. It's actually about the citizens themselves participating in the democracy. And so the second point that my partner Michelle brought up was that it increased speed and the ability to organize. And she brought up the fact that old forms are no longer the best option, because old forms can be censored, they can have biased information out there, and that the internet can bypass these mainstream media that can be biased and promote the actual truth out there to force the mainstream media to buy on to actually what's going on in the world. And the second point that she brought up was about being able to organize. And without the internet, specifically the movements in Egypt and Tunisia and these other countries would not have been able to happen, because they would not have been able to pull that many people together without the government coming down quickly to squash that democratic movement from happening. And so my third point is in relation to its increase to access information that Susumu brought up, is that without this information, people are not going to know what's going on within their own country or within the world in relation to their country. And so without this, we can't actually see people engaging in democracy. So although the internet had previously not been available in the example of George Washington, but what we can see today is that it's essential in today's day and age, because for people to know what's going on within the own office of their representatives or around the world under the militaries, without having this access to knowledge, without being able to enforce their beliefs to the representatives and encouraging democracy, there would be no democracy. And so that's why we can see that the internet is essential to democracy in today's day and age. Thank you.
Thank you. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce tonight's guest speaker. Dr. Kathleen Hall Jamieson is the Dean Emeritus at the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. She is a prolific scholar, having authored or co-authored probably half the books in my office, including The Obama Victory, How Media, Money, and Messages Shaped the 2008 Election, Presidents Creating the Presidency, The Echo Chamber, Rush Limbaugh and the Conservative Media Establishment, Unspun, Finding Facts in a World of Disinformation, Presidential Debates, Beyond the Double Bind, Women in Leadership, and my personal favorite, a book that was authored two decades ago, and a book that I think accurately describes the political situation in our state, Dirty Politics. Those are impressive achievements, and if I started talking about her articles, we'd be here until 11 o'clock. In addition to her academic work, Dr. Jamieson has been very active in engaging the public about her arguments. She's been a guest commentator on the CBS News, on a PBS, and she's worked with colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania to create factcheck.org, which really holds politicians up to the truth standard for the claims that they make in political media. So without any further delay, I'd like to welcome Dr. Kathleen Hall Jamieson.
Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Now, if you say that I'm the person who originated factcheck.org, you realize I've got a horse in this race, because I think factcheck.org is indispensable to democratic accountability processes. And as a result, the internet obviously has some democratizing tendencies that I think can be well deployed by scholars. You see where I'm going. I would like to make three comments about this very well-argued and engaged debate. The first is that there is a tendency to be trapped in what we have as available evidence and think that it's all of the evidence that would be there if we could know everything that we could know. And I worry about that as we make these arguments about the internet, particularly how the internet is functioning in other countries in situations in which we know we don't have complete evidence. So let me offer you just some cautions. One, in most of these countries that are being cited, the internet usage that is at play in these revolutions or these moments is relatively small. That is, the number of people who are subscribing and actually participating is relatively small. Now, it doesn't mean that they couldn't be having a large effect, but we can gather that kind of evidence. And so you're able to say, well, how many people are on the site at any given time against how many people are in the population. And then we don't know that the numbers on the site actually represent individuals because, as you know, you could have the same individual going on the site repeatedly. And so there are some kinds of evidentiary problems underlying our ability to know how much is at play there. Second reason that this is an evidentiary issue, we don't know what else was at play. We don't know what the social scientists would call the other confounding variables might be. So it's possible that there are all sorts of things that are happening at the same time that we don't see and that aren't being reflected through the stream of information we do see, and we're overgeneralizing what we see to think it has a causal power that is greater than what may actually be there. Let me give you Egypt as an example. The mainstream media from around the world actually got on the ground into Egypt relatively quickly, and as a result started transmitting back to the world a very powerful narrative, and it was a narrative that was on one side of that process. And it was reflecting back to the Egyptians in power a narrative of the world community coming in through traditional mainstream media streams that suggested that they probably would be well advised not to engage in violence and to go quietly. Now, that's happening at the same time that these other things are happening. Granted, some of the social media phenomena appear to be there a little ahead of it, but not by a whole lot. So before one says, this little piece did this piece over here, one has to ask, what other pieces were there on the table? And we don't actually know, and we don't know what the interactions are, but we do know that at the point at which the forces there began to abuse the journalists, the narrative swung dramatically, and in a way that increased the sympathy of the world community, presumably, given the consistency of the narrative, for one side in the structure. Third problem. Notice I've said one side as if there are two. Well, we don't know that. What we know is that there was opposition, but we don't know that it had any kind of coherence other than the fact that it was opposition. So here's my second large point built out of that. When we use the word democracy, and it's the reason for some of the slippage in this debate, we don't actually know that those forces that ultimately are, let's say, victorious, just for the sake of picking a bad word, are democratic. We don't know that they're any better than the forces that have been displaced. Now, someplace down the line we will know, but we're not really there yet. So when the military move in place of an alternative structure, and the military were complicitous with the previous structure, I hesitate to say that's democracy. And as a result, I've got a wait and see attitude about whether that speaks to the issue that's being debated tonight, which is essential to democracy. And reason democracy also is a problematic concept for me is that I can see the possibility that some things that are good for what I call democracy are bad for what I would call those in power in the United States. And sometimes I hear the debate conflating the U.S. administration, U.S. government, U.S. country, and democracy as if they're all exactly the same thing. I want to allow for the possibility that there are times in which the U.S. government, under either party, acts in ways that I consider undemocratic. And so to argue that something makes it more difficult for someone to act in a certain way, hence it must be bad for the country and the government, I'm not so sure about that if the dominant term that one's analyzing is democracy. And that's my second large point. First being, we've got to be careful about what we really can know right now. Be careful that we're not overgeneralizing and confusing an environment that may have confounding variables in it. Second, this word democracy needs to be used a little bit carefully in some of these examples, including some in the U.S. And here's my third and final point. What is very instructive about debates of this sort is that the debates of this sort remind us that on most issues there are alternative sides. And in the process, propositions that are at play can do a real disservice to what it is that you learn from these kinds of exchanges. Let me rephrase what I think we learned tonight. The internet, and I think it's internets, not internet, technically, given the way it's configured. The internets can facilitate democratic movements. They can also repress democratic movements, or at least they can facilitate oppositional movements or repress oppositional movements. So the tendency is both ways. They can help and they can hinder. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're essential, but I think you can make the case that there are pluses and there are minuses here. And so I think what we've learned from the exchange is you wouldn't want to take one pure side in this debate without accommodating a whole lot of the evidence on the other side. And as a result, I'm delighted that the people who have put this together, and thank you to all of you, have not declared that we should declare a victor, that is, a winner. As a former varsity debater, I remember how frustrating it was to have someone say, well, you won 3 and you won 2, and so the argument predominantly is won on that side, as if there wasn't a whole lot of merit in alternative sides. And I think it's very valuable to be able to feature both the positives and the negatives in the context of an environment in which we test our evidence vigilantly and are very careful about how we use the word democracy. I was very impressed by the examples that were used on both sides. But there's always a danger that when you're using examples, they're very specific to that moment in those circumstances, and that you can't generalize them up to something as broad as a claim about essentiality. And so I would ask the question differently than what it was phrased tonight, and it would produce a very different debate than you have been asked to offer us. I would ask, are there democratizing tendencies inherent in this medium or not? And are the surveillance tendencies inherent in this medium, in the presence of those democratizing tendencies, going to act in some ways in some circumstances and other ways in others, and could we predict how that's going to occur and how to minimize what is harmful and maximize what is useful. Some media, I think, have democratizing tendencies built into their structure. And I think some media do not. And I think this is a structure, this Internet's structure, that has both. And the question is, how do you work this in a way that maximizes the advantage? And I'd like to give you one answer. One answer is the corporations that control the underlying structures are in countries other than those that are utilizing them, and as a result can act from an independent power base in order to ensure that when a country tries to cut off access, there is an end run around the cutoff that can be deployed from outside. I think that combination creates the capacity, for example, when a country begins to shut down sites, as repressive regimes routinely do as they're facing so-called democratic elections, for this structure controlled outside the country by corporations to provide ways to create reroutings so that you can still get to the information without being tracked and hence jailed. And I think that's an important way to phrase the question because it yields a more sophisticated analysis. I very much appreciate the arguments on both sides, the quality of the evidence, the extent of the clash, and the fact that you are here. And I know these students will take any hard questions I can't handle. So if you have any, please raise them. And if you don't, we're going to go out and celebrate this beautiful spring weather. Yeah, please take the microphone and tell us who you are.
So I'm Neil. I teach political science here. And I want to ask about a generational difference here in America. So I'm 34 years old. I take a daily newspaper. And
How do you read it?
Sitting at the table, an actual newspaper.
Okay, so it's real paper.
Because I'm 34 going on 80.
Okay.
I think I will someday be the last daily newspaper subscriber in the country. But so just a proposition about American democracy. I think you could argue that the Internet is essential for American democracy for anyone younger than me, because anyone younger than me has either never gotten the ability or has lost the ability to actually communicate intelligently with others without the Internet. And it isn't necessarily essential for those older than me. And so does that mean the Internet is essential or not essential in a country where we're actually not talking about repression, being able to vote, being able to live, but the quality of our democracy?
Let me just respond to one of your assumptions. The older generation, and I put myself there, but I don't put you there, is increasingly starting to look like the second cohort generation, where I would put you, which is increasingly starting to look like the younger generation. This is a technology that is being assimilated very, very rapidly, and not necessarily uniformly across the types within it, but nonetheless is increasingly becoming a normative mode of delivery. And we run into a problem when we study newspaper readership. It's the reason for asking, how do you read? Because the public appears to tell us in surveys it reads newspapers less, but we believe all the available evidence says it's actually reading newspapers more. It just isn't calling them newspapers because their content has been aggregated online. And as a result, there probably is more total exposure to more news, whether you call it paper or not, that came from something you would call a traditional media source, whether a paper or not, than there has been in the past. And we know from the largest survey the academic community does of the electorate during election years in 2008, that's an Annenberg Public Policy Center survey, which is why I can tell you that people who are reliant upon the Internet for political information are more knowledgeable than those who are not. And so in net, the information advantage to use is there. That also in the presence of a finding that those who report having gotten email from their friends within the last 10 days are more likely to believe the most likely distributed viral deceptions. So even in the presence of that, and that's the negative tendency, you still have a net gain in information out of this medium. And the reason that's very encouraging information is because not all media produce that effect. Local news consumption, for example, that is local evening news, the kind of stuff that you get sports and weather and crime and fires in Philadelphia. I'm sure you don't just get those three things from St. Cloud or from Minneapolis. Actually drops political knowledge. You actually see a reduction in political knowledge, probably because so many ads for politics are clustered around it with so little fact-checking in it. I'm looking for a question for one of these debaters. Anybody? Something you know I can't handle. You know I won't try to handle. Yeah, come on up. Tell us who you are. I like your jacket.
What?
I like your jacket.
Kevin, and then I know it was talked about on the opposition, the use of the internet as kind of a weapon to be able to go out and find those who are opposing a certain regime and then take them down. But I would like to look at the idea of not as a weapon for the government, but also as a weapon for the people, such as the idea of the hacker group known as Anonymous, who, along with, well, which kind of helped WikiLeaks in several ways, and kind of kept them up, and those who opposed WikiLeaks attacked them, as well as the fact that the use of the internet to hack places like the Iranian nuclear program.
Yeah.
And most recently, an Iranian, it is actually an article that came out today about a person in Iran who has claimed to have hacked into Google, Yahoo, and I think 2 or 3 other sites, and got security certificates from there, which are very vital and can allow them to manipulate those very powerful sites.
Yeah.
I'd just like to see how you guys feel.
I can tell you how the negative feels. Negative, what do you think about this wonderful information just provided by your colleague?
I think I'll leave that question to the professor. Thank you.
How about the affirmative? How do you feel about this?
No comment. No, but I mean, I definitely think that's a valuable point, that it can be used in negative ways. But at the same time, like, those same hacking groups can hack into systems to find this information that shows that the government is doing things wrong, and to allow citizens to be aware of, like, what is going on within their own governments.
Yeah. I'm going to be talking tomorrow night at a location whose name I do not remember. Goreski Dining Center. Thank you. About the surveillance functions and the implications for political speech. This is not a question that's going to parse simply as it's a positive or a negative. There are going to be downsides all over this, and you're seeing that with the illustrations that you're marshaling. You could say the same of radio. I mean, radio gave us Father Coughlin, but radio gave us the fireside chats of FDR. And so, the question is, how do we marshal this, and how do we as a society maximize the potential of this very powerful set of tools? Yes, last question or comment.
Lucas Ramsey again. I have a kind of a question. The opposition mentioned that a lot of tyrannical governments use the internet as a distraction. And I'm wondering how common that is sort of in standing democracies, because I know a lot of people in my dorm room go to YouTube a lot more than they go to some website related to news media or something like that.
I'm not a conspiracy theorist, so I don't think the Obama administration is posting all those cat videos.
I'm not saying it's something, that our government is perpetuating.
Yeah.
But I'm saying perhaps, it's still happening.
Yeah.
So it's kind of related to your question as to how do we maximize the good, and I'm wondering if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, let me reframe it this way. We have the most educated electorate we have ever had in the history of this country. And that electorate comes into this new information environment with certain dispositions that it will act on or not. And if we take this highly educated audience and we say it's going to occupy its time watching cat videos and babies laughing at parents blowing their nose, that doesn't speak very well for our educational structures, because it means we haven't created an appetite for everything that is very positive that's on the web. And rather than focusing on the supply side, I'd focus on the demand side and worry about our having control as an educational structure most of your life, right? Have we not? I mean, have we not had you in school since you were 5? Some of you since you were 2? And are we not going to keep you here as long as we possibly can get tuition from you? And And as a result, we have had more total time to give you the opportunity to find satisfaction in great art and great culture, and all of those things that are now delivered in this forum in ways that are wonderful, highly accessible knowledge that before you had to pay or have the resources to get to in museums are now available online, and in very satisfying ways, very good reproductions. And so if you don't take advantage of that, not you specifically, you as a generation, this highly educated generation, I think those of us who educated you just ought to go and hide. And with that, I hope to see you tomorrow evening. And thank you very much. Please join me in applauding our debaters.